Hey, welcome to Giraffe Academy. My name is Mike. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about working with numbers in Ruby. So we're going to take a deep dive and we're going to look at all the different things you can do with numbers. We'll talk about the different types of numbers in Ruby. And we're going to look at some awesome Ruby methods that we can use on our numbers to do a bunch of different stuff. So this is going to be a pretty cool tutorial. So down here, I'm just going to show you guys the basics of working with numbers. I could just say like puts, and this will just print something out onto the screen just so we can kind of see what's going on. When I want to use a number in Ruby, it's really easy. You just type out the number. So I could type out like 5, for example. And now this is going to get printed out onto the screen as 5. In addition to just using whole numbers like this, we could also use decimal numbers. So I could say like 5.86543. It's going to do exactly the same thing. So now over here, it'll be able to print that out. We can also use negative numbers. So I can put a negative in front of here. And again, Ruby's going to have no problem dealing with negative numbers. In addition to just using numbers, though, we can also use basic arithmetic. So for example, I could say like 5 plus 9. And this will actually be able to go through and print out the answer. So not only is Ruby going to print out 5 plus 9, it's actually going to do that calculation for us and print the answer out onto the screen, which is pretty cool. So we can use addition, we could use subtraction. We could use multiplication, which is just this asterisk. We could use division. So those are like the 4 basic types of arithmetic, but we can also use exponentials. So for example, let's say I wanted to take 2 raised to like the 3rd power. I can just do something like this. I can say 2 multiplication, multiplication, so 2 asterisks and then 3. And this is basically going to be the same thing as saying 2 raised to the 3rd power. So now we should get 2 cubed, which is 8. So this can be a really handy operation here. We can also use something else which is called the modulus operator. So I could say, for example, 10, a percent sign, and then 3. And what this is going to do is it's going to take 10, it's going to divide it by 3, and it's going to spit out the remainder. So 10 divided by 3 is 3, right? 369 with a remainder of 1. So when I run this, you'll see it prints out a 1. So it's basically printing out the remainder that we get from dividing these two numbers. And that can be pretty useful. In addition to just having numbers over here like this, I could also store numbers inside of a variable. So I could come over here and say like num, this is the name of the variable, and we could set it equal to like 20. And then down here, if I wanted to access that number, I can just print out the variable. So now we're printing out the actual variable. And I want to point out one cool thing with numbers is you can actually print out numbers and strings inside of the same print statement. So for example, I could say like my fave num, and over here, I can put a plus sign. And what this is basically going to allow me to do is print out this string alongside this number. But you'll see over here, when I actually print this out, we're going to get a couple errors. And the first thing we have to do is we always want to put this inside of parentheses. So I'm going to surround this whole thing with parentheses. That's because we're referring to this variable. But also, if I want to print out a number alongside of a string, I actually have to convert this number into a string. And I can do that by saying num dot to underscore s. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to take this number, it's going to convert it into a string, and then we'll be able to print both of these side by side. So you can see now it just says my fave num 20. That's a really useful way to do something like that. So in addition to just working with normal numbers, we can actually use special things called methods. And a method is essentially just a block of code that we can call, which will either modify our number or it'll give us information about our number. Sometimes it'll also do like mathematical calculations on the number. So down here I could say like puts num. When I want to access one of these number methods, I can say dot, and then I can type out the name of the method that I want to use. So for example, I could say num.abs and an open and close parentheses. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to tell me the absolute value of num. So if I put like a negative 20 up here, now this is just going to return 20 because it's giving me the absolute value. There's also some methods that we can use with decimal numbers. So for example, if this was like 20.487, I can use num.round, and this will actually round the number for me. So over here, you'll see we just get 20. So it's basically rounded the number. But if I was to make this like a 6, now we should get 21. So it's rounding it up or down. You can also use a ceiling and a floor function. So a ceiling will always take the higher number, and the floor will always take the lower number. So for example, if I said 20.187, or let's just say 20.1, and I said num.ceil, this is actually just going to return 21. So it's going to give us the highest number, or it's going to give us the next highest number from 20. If I was to say like 20.9 and I said num.floor, this is just going to give me 20. So it's basically just going to cut off that decimal point, give me the lower number. In addition to just using these normal methods, or you also hear these referred to sometimes as functions. So in addition to using these methods or functions, we can also use other special methods which are inside of something called the math class. And don't worry too much about what a class is, but essentially there's this entity inside of our Ruby programs called math, and we can use it to perform specific math operations on numbers. So if I came over here, I could type out math like that with a capital M. I can type a dot. And now inside of this math class, and again, don't worry too much about what a class is, but inside of this math entity in Ruby, there's a bunch of these methods that we can use. So for example, I could say math.sqrt and an open and close parentheses. Now inside of this open and close parentheses, I can give this a number. So for example, I could put like 36 inside of here. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us the square root of this number 36. So you can see over here we get 6. You could also use something like the logarithmic function. So I could say math.log, put like a 1 in here, and now we're going to get 0.0 back. So there's a lot of these different like math operations. You can do a lot of things with like sine, cosine, tangent, like logarithmic stuff. So this can be really useful if you're just trying to work with math inside of Ruby. So the last thing I want to talk to you guys about in this tutorial is working with floating point numbers and working with integer numbers. So there's two basic types of numbers in Ruby. We have integer numbers, which are like whole numbers. So an integer would be like 20 or 21 or 22. And we also have decimal numbers, which would be like 22.1, 22.2, etc. Integers and floats can be used inside of Ruby basically interchangeably, although there are two like separate types. So Ruby does distinguish between a whole number and a floating point number. But I want to show you guys how we can use these together. So for example, like if I came down here and I just added two integers, like I added 1 plus 7, you'll notice that we're gonna get an integer back. So it's gonna be 8. But if I added like 1.0 and 7, now you'll see we're getting a floating point number back. So we're getting a decimal back. So whenever you add two integers, you always get an integer back, or multiply two integers, divide, subtract two integers, you're always gonna get an integer back. So for example, if I said like 10 divided by 7, this shouldn't be an integer number. This should be like some long decimal number, but you'll notice that I'm just getting a 1 back. So I'm only getting an integer back. But if I said like 10 divided by 7.0, now I'm gonna get the full number back. So whenever you're using an integer and a floating point number together to do some operation, you're always gonna get a floating point back. If you're using two integers, you'll get an integer back. And if you're using two floats, obviously you're gonna get a floating point number back. So that's kind of the difference between those two. And Ruby doesn't really give you too much of a hassle when you're using numbers. You know, you can basically use integers and floats interchangeably, but just know that Ruby does distinguish between the two of them. So if you're doing different types of math with different types of numbers like integers or floating point numbers, there's going to be a difference in the type of answer that you're going to get. So that's really the basics of working with numbers. I mean, I could spend all day talking about all the different methods and, you know, little caveats here and there that you can use with numbers in Ruby, but I think that's kind of a good coverage of the basics. And so now your job is just to go off and play around with all this different stuff and really just get comfortable working with numbers in your Ruby programs. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.